I want to thank all of you for joining us today for Food in the 20th Century Art by Carolyn Tillie. This is a continuation of a talk, or a slightly different talk, that she did earlier for us. She has talked before of Feast for the Eyes, her wonderful book, Edible Art from Apple to Zucchini. I am loving working with Carrie. She is a member of a number of organizations that I belong with. She is a culinary historian. She is also an artist and actually produced a lot of the art that she's going to be showing today. I'm going to let her introduce herself more than me, and then I'll ask her some questions later as well as you. So Carrie, take it away.
Well, thank you. I have to say I'm really not showing any of my art, although I am wearing a necklace that I made, which is constructed olive dried, naturally dried and assembled pasta. So, but this talk, as a stepping stone from my last discussion, that one was much more the history of food in the uses of art, and that includes folk art and craft art. And this is going to be much more about food in 20th century art, i.e. fine art, museums, and the formal art world. So it's a little bit different. I'm going to do some little art history, and I apologize. I'm going to go as quickly as I can through that just to lay the groundwork so you understand how foodstuffs, as they're now called, became so prevalent in the art world. And I'm also going to give you a little viewer's advisory. I'm going to show some images that include nudity and some images that are a little bit disturbing. And I apologize if you have to look away, and I'll try and warn you ahead of time, but there are some disturbing images, but I think they're important in the grand scheme of what happened in the 20th century for food as art. Again, when most people, this is the cover of my book, and it is a recreation of an Arkan Boldo face by Klaus Enrique. And he did a similar one, and I'm sorry, my click-through isn't working. So I'm going to see if, there we go. The original on the left, Vertumnus by Arkan Boldo in 1591, was reimagined by Klaus Enrique, like the cover of my book, complete with real food. And as opposed to representing food in art, this discussion is entirely about the use of food in art. So in 2019, I flew to Los Angeles from San Francisco to attend an event at Disney Hall. And you can see, this was just a shot that I took of the number of people sitting in the audience, waiting to watch an 82-year-old artist, Allison Knowles, a Fluxus artist, make a salad. And that was the name of the piece that she was recreating, that she had originated in the 1960s. And with a handful of helpers, I'm sorry, she's now 88, so she would have been 85 then. She chopped vegetables to the beats of live music that was happening on stage. As the salad ingredients began spilling out onto the tarp, she came around to the side, put on some booties, was handed dressing, and then she proceeded to toss the salad. And yours truly, a friend of yours and mine, Richard Foss, and my dear friend Joanne got to eat that salad. In 2012, Allison Knowles said of this original staging that she was interested in everyone eating, not only together, but the same thing. And they usually eat the same quantity, the same portions. And that the idea of having such a quantity of food served to everyone was kind of astonishing. So this was a form of performance art and integrative art. And the fact that Disney Hall was packed with people just wanting to watch somebody make and serve a salad was really overwhelming and lovely for me. So I'm going to do a really quick jump through Art History 101 to get you to the 20th century. If you were in my original discussion, you learned that food was first used in the creation of art almost 200,000 years ago, with the discovery of pigments inside an abalone shell and with the carving of some ochre. Artists would get supplies from the kitchen up to the medieval era, into the development of pigments and mediums. Tempera paint was made with eggs. Oil paints were mixed with poppy seed oils and fig tree sap and sugar syrups. Greek it's to burn in, the use of beeswax in encaustic, that's it, pardon me, was used with beeswax. So art through the next 2,000 years or so used food to make their mediums. And these sort of mediums would be the mainstay through the Renaissance and Baroque and Rococo up until the end of the 19th century. And at this point, philosophically, the paintings of the Impressionists laid waste to the academic and cerebral art establishment. And it was making way for a radical revolution that we're going to start exploring. Out of that upheaval came a dizzying array of artistic expression, including movements that broke imaginative ground. Post-Impressionism, which was predominantly French, used emotions to start, that would come into play. It emerged as a reaction against Impressionist concern for the naturalistic depiction of light and color. The Fauvists from 1905 to 1908 were termed the wild beasts, and they used a strong use of non-naturalistic colors, over-representation or realism, with loose brushwork and simplified forms. It was considered the first avant-garde art movement of the 20th century. Cubism, heavily influenced by music and literature and architecture, was a common thread that was an investigation of simplifying into basic geometric forms the separate elements of objects and desire. Salvador Dali dabbled in Cubism, but much later in the late 20s, and he's going to become very prevalent in our discussion. So what started to happen at this point, we have 1907 to the 20s and the end of Fauvism and these experiments, was World War I. And this World War I began to shape how artists were changing, looking at the world. Futurism was more than just an art movement. It was also a social movement that was full of manifestos that emphasized dynamism, speed, technology, youth, and violence. At its head was F.T. Marinetti, and he advocated the modernization and cultural rejuvenation of Italy. In 1909, he wrote a manifesto that first appeared in Italy and less than 2 weeks later in France. This started blurring the lines outside of a single country for the movement. Now, Marinetti gets a bad rap at this point in our generation because he was a bit of a fascist. And I am going to kind of look that philosophy aside for his importance as the introduction of food into modern art. The Futurists practiced in every medium. They were painting and sculpting, industrial design and graphic design. and even some cooking that we're going to be seeing shortly. 1916, which also rose, Dadaism, which rose from World War I, rejected logic and embraced the concept of ready-mades. It originally dealt more with poetry than fine art. And there were fine artists that were involved from the beginning, but it started as an anti-art. They were also producing manifestos and trying to get people to forget everything that they knew and let life exist according to chance. Chance is a major component of Dadaism, and it's meant to be meaningless and absurd. It was also the first truly international art movement and existed in Germany and Switzerland, Romania, and New York. It had elements of humor, and the artists wanted to dismantle fixed notions about art, specifically Marcel Duchamp, by creating a ready-made, using this toilet, this urinal, and just painting I Mutt on the side and putting it in a museum, elevated an everyday object into a piece of work, a piece of art. Now, Surrealism, which overlapped a little bit with Dadaism, and as did many of the artists, was a term coined by Guillaume Apollinaire in 1917. During the war, André Breton, who was trained in medicine, served in a neurological hospital and used Freud's methods for soldiers suffering from shell shock. Surrealism's mission was quite different from Dada. They took their art seriously and didn't aspire to be anti-art. They also had manifestos that first dealt with the ideas of autonomy, which sound a lot like the ideas of chance, but aren't exactly the same. It mostly dealt with ideas of unconsciousness. Their second manifesto even dealt more so with the ideas of the unconscious mind. While the Surrealists were highly influenced by Freud, the Dadaists were not. And we can't invoke Surrealism without the grandfather of Surrealism, Salvador Dali. And here's where we begin to see the first major aspects of food being incorporated. Excuse me. Again, Dali dabbled in Cubism and Dadaism, but he's known more as a surrealist. He described this surrealist sculpture, the retrospective bust of a woman, as it not only represents a woman as an object, but explicitly as one to be consumed. The baguette that crowns her head and cobs of corn that dangle around her neck. It was a fetishistic way to maximize a tangible reality for him. This is also the beginning of Dali's obsession with lobsters. And it began in 1935 when he wrote, "I do not understand why, when I ask for a grilled lobster in a restaurant, I am never served a cooked telephone. I do not understand why champagne is always chilled, and why, on the other hand, telephones, which are habitually so frightfully warm and disagreeably sticky to the touch, are not also put in silver buckets with crushed ice around them." These early 1930s was a maelstrom where artistic endeavors propelled these movements forward with the utilization of everyday items, from junk to food, resulting in a veritable explosion of food-themed artworks. And while the term installation art and performance art would not enter the artistic vernacular until the 60s or 70s, these genres use everyday material owe a great deal of debt to the early surrealists and futurists. Back in Italy, in 1932, about the same time that Dali is creating his lobster, F.T. Marinetti writes the Futurist Cookbook, and this was his manifesto on food. It's arguably the first cookbook ever written by an artist for purely artistic purposes. Now, the volume proposed that some dishes were to be served but not eaten, and only to be experienced by the eyes or the nose. There was also to be a complete abandonment of pasta as food, because Marinetti believed it lacked passion and it was too reminiscent of worms. A precursor to the modernist chefs, futurists unwillingly predicted that scientific equipment would replace traditional kitchen implements. He threw parties, and thankfully, there are images that exist of these events. You can see, like on the picture on the right, that some of the food is on a model of a ship on the table, and that there's wheels hanging. It was a wheel that was used at the back as a back of a chair. The cookbook included 11 tenets of futurist food. I'm going to just mention these briefly. Originality and harmony in table setting, absolute originality in food, invention of appetizing food sculptures whose original harmony of form and color feeds the eyes, the abolition of the knife and fork, which can give pre-labial tactile pleasure. You'll see that there's no place settings on those tables. The use of perfumes to enhance tasting, that every dish would be preceded by a perfume. The use of music was limited to the intervals between courses so as not to distract the sensitivity of the tongue or the palate. The abolition of speech making and politics at the table. The use of prescribed doses of poetry and music as surprise ingredients to accentuate the flavors of a given dish. Here's another setting. Some more of the tenets, the rapid presentation between courses under the eyes and nostrils of the guest, the creation of simultaneous and changing canapes, which contain 10, 20 or more flavors to be tasted in rapid succession. And number 11, the battery of scientific instruments in the kitchen, ionizers, to give liquid and food the perfume of ozone, electrolyzers to decompose juices and extracts, colloidal mills to pulverize flours, dried fruits, drugs, atmospheric and vacuum stills, centrifugal autoclaves, dialyzers. For any of you who have ever dined out recently, does this sound familiar? It's what we now have as molecular gastronomy. So these 1932, 90 years ago, the futurists were presciently presupposing what we now have from Ferran Adria's El Bulli to Nathan Myhrvold's modernist movement, Grant Achaz's Alinea. And if you've ever been to Chicago, Grant Achaz, his restaurant Alinea serves a dish called Lamb 86, in which you're given a very small portion of cooked lamb with 86 little side dishes. And you can see, like, especially that one in the very center, some of it's gelatinous, some of it's dried and powdered, and it uses all of those tools that Marinetti had written about. So I wanted to jump ahead real quick just to show you how much these early influencers have transformed our own way of cooking and eating. So back to the late 30s, and Salvador Dali and his lobsters, and our first bit of nudity. It has been suggested that there's a Freudian castration theory behind Dali's symbolism with lobsters, because he really used them a lot. The photo on the left was taken in 1939 by George Platt Lynes during this photographic collaboration entitled The Dream of Venus. This was part of an invitation that Dali had received to create a pavilion for the 1939 World's Fair, which was staged in New York. The likes of the pavilion had never been seen before, and The resulting Dream of Venus Pavilion was one part amusement ride and two-part surrealist installation art with a sprinkling of female nudity and a dash of absurdity. Tickets to enter the pavilion were purchased through this fish-headed shaped kiosk. You would enter into an oceanic funhouse where partially clad living liquid ladies swam through giant tanks filled with fanciful creatures. True to the surrealist philosophies of unlocking images that would explore the unconscious worlds of sexuality, desire, and violence. A 36-foot bed was covered with flowers where a reclining Venus would sleep, surrounded by lobsters that would crawl around her. And if you go to YouTube, there is a video that walks through many of these images. And just because they're so fun, I wanted to give you one last image of Dali and his lobster obsession. We know that Dali was so obsessed with food, and he painted it. And not wanting to give you those images of representations, I will show you quickly that he, in 1973, wrote a food-themed cookbook as well, I think kind of coming on the heels of the Marinetti cookbook, Les Dîners de Gala. And it's now been reprinted. So I recommend looking at that at some point for his, what even it says, new edition, surrealistic cult of cookery. We're going to jump through, now that we finished in the 30s with Dali's Dreams of Venus, and briefly the 40s and 50s. This is now World War II and post-World War II, specifically in America, saw the development of abstract expressionism. And the term was first coined in 46, but it had been used in Germany in the 20s. And arguably Kandinsky's work of the late 20s could be considered abstract expressionist. But the art movement itself led to a really dramatic happening of what was happening in the 60s on both sides of the pond. The 1950s was a time of great social upheaval, and it was earmarked by riots and protests. Civil resistance fought for racial and gender equality, and the anti-establishment philosophies found their way into the art world. Alan Capro was a student of John Cage who had experimented with what was called musical happenings at Black Mountain College as early as 1952. But Capro combined it into a theater and visual arts element with the discordant music as a performance art genre. And his first one was really listed in 1959. So you can see the pictures, the 1964 happening of literally called Women Licking Jam Off of a Car. And in 1970, built near the Berlin Wall, Sweet Wall was a wall that was constructed of bread that he used jam as mortar. And these weren't really called performance art yet. That term hadn't come into common usage. They were using John Cage's concept of happenings. Simultaneously, early in the 60s, 59 and 60, EAT art was being established. Now, EAT is a double entendre because the EAT actually stood for Experiments in Art and Technology. And it was a movement formed to develop and build collaborations between engineers and artists, which to me is, again, harkens back to the Marinetti use of the engineering of dinners with equipment. EAT art was originally launched by artists Robert Whitman and Robert Rauschenberg and engineers Fred Waldauer and Billy Kluver in '67. But Daniel Spiori is the one who is most known because of the pieces that he created, these what were known as assemblages, usually the remains of meals eaten by individuals. That would include the plates and the silverware and the glasses, ultimately fixed to a table or board and then displayed on the wall. Now, in the 1960s, Joseph Beuys was the godfather of Fluxus, and this is where the Alison Knowles Eat Salad would have been performed around this era. Fluxus was an international, interdisciplinary community of artists, composers, designers, and poets who engaged in experimental art performances which emphasized artistic process over the finished product. Joseph Beuys served in World War II, and he has a great mythology about him. He was stationed in the Crimea, and as a member of a bomber unit was in a devastating car crash. He fashioned a myth that was about himself, that he was rescued by nomadic Tartar tribesmen who wrapped his broken body in animal fat and felt and nursed him back to health. The fat, namely the butter, was to become very predominant in his work. The piece on the right, the Capri battery, has been reproduced a number of times, and I've seen it in Los Angeles. But what I would highly recommend that you look into is a film that came out in 2018 called Never Look Away. And the movie's actually about the artist Gerhard Richter, but in the movie, the young student goes to a school where he's taught by Joseph Beuys. And so I showed you the Capri battery because in the movie, these are stills from the movie, there's a lemon on his desk as an allusion to this artwork that has yet to be created. But there's beautiful images in the film of him working with fat and butter the way Joseph Beuys really did. So it is a movie I recommend on many levels, artistically, as well as a good introduction to Fluxus. A very notable Fluxus artist was a young Yoko Ono. And in 1966, she staged an exhibition in London where she placed an apple on a pedestal. And as the story goes, John Lennon had heard of this amazing woman who was going to be putting on a show and that it was going to be a bit of a happening. And he's the one who used that word. Lennon describes himself as astounded at the apple on sale for 200 quid. I thought it was fantastic. I got her work immediately. It was 200 quid to watch the fresh apple decompose. The piece appealed to Lennon as he didn't have that much knowledge about avant-garde or underground art. And apologizing, actually not even apologizing, he took the apple off the stand and he took a bite out of it. Yoko was so incensed and furious that they got into quite a fight. And I believe this is when they met. What this ended up segueing to, that many of you will understandably and remember, was the Beatles using that green apple on their label. And so that's just wonderful trivia. A word of caution about some of the upcoming images. Fluxus segued and began the 1960s into the Viennese Actionists. And they started in 1960. They were very short-lived and transgressive. There were 4 artists that I'm going to show you who all incorporated food into rather gruesome performance pieces that oftentimes included animal blood and entrails. this is Gunter Bruce, and instead of happenings, their performance pieces were known as actions. They reveled in the grotesque, and oftentimes there was butchery and gastronomy. There was some self-mutilization. Gunter would writhe in milk and egg and breadcrumbs. And it was a reaction to what they had experienced coming out of the war and what was happening in Vienna during the 50s. Hermann Nisch, who was a trained musician and dramatist, established these organ mystery theaters. And it's an action piece that involved music of his own composition with an army of devotees who would butcher and eviscerate an ox and then quite literally writhe in the blood and the entrails that ensued. Otto Mule was really the bad boy of the four, and he was jailed for pretty unspeakable acts. But before that happened, he worked within classical themes of still life and classical mythology. He would create these living still life where his models would push their heads and body parts through the table, and the mule would set other food pieces around, sometimes involved people eating, and but you can see in the picture there's a leek and some oranges, and the pictures were taken, but they were very much works that other people, you would come and see and be involved in. You would partake as well. The fourth Viennese actionist, the one with the saddest reputation, is Rudolf Schwarzkogler. He was the youngest, and he suffered an untimely death at the age of 29 by a fatal fall from a fourth-story window. There was speculation that it was suicide, and very sadly, his death was mythologized by a Time magazine journalist who originated the falsehood that Schwarzkogler died due to self-inflicted mutilation of a particular sexual organ. So the picture on the right alludes to, it was one of the pictures that exist that look much more gruesome, when in fact it was a series of photographs that involved a fish, but the imagery made it apparent of it being something other than a fish. So these actionists, the happenings, the Alan Capros and the Yoko Onos and the Alison Knowles, this is all leading through the 60s into the early 70s. And at this point, foodstuffs are becoming very, very predominant. We have Dieter Roth, and he was close friends with many in the Fluxus movement, but he very deliberately kept his distance from them. He had differing philosophical ideals. He was known for iconic and irreverent use of non-traditional materials and was very obsessed with decay and rot. So Staple Cheese, a race, was an installation work that he did in Los Angeles in the summer of 1970. It was a series of 37 suitcases into which he had filled with various cheeses throughout the gallery space. Each day the suitcases would close, the gallery would close, and then they would reopen the cases in the gallery the morning after. There was cheddar and Limburger and Camembert. And the idea of the chase was to see which cheese was going to melt and decompose the quickest. So the gallery had horizontal lines on the walls where some of the cheeses had been placed, with plastic panels with the idea that the first cheese to melt all the way down would win. But the majority of the cheeses dried up before they reached the base of the wall. Regrettably, within a few days, the overpowering smell and the maggots and the flies made it impossible to enter the room, and the gallery owners had to take all of the suitcases out to the Mojave Desert to bury them. So it was well written about and pretty groundbreaking for the time. Diderot is also very much known for his work in chocolate and seeds. He believed that art should change like a man himself, grow old and die. And he created these self-portraits of himself in chocolate and birdseed with the idea that they would decompose. And it's interesting to read now about preservationists, art preservationists who are working to make sure that they don't decompose. The picture on his left is actually Diderot's son, who is helping keep some of these things alive. His whole family is working to keep the mainstay of these chocolate self-portraits in existence. Now, in the 1970s, we have someone that you might be familiar with. Yayoi Kusama is well known now for her pumpkins and her polka dots. But before she became obsessed with these, she was obsessed with potatoes. And this is right when she came to New York in the early 70s. She was very young when she did a series of installations and created this garment for herself. Now, Yayoi was not the first to wear food. The American artist Robert Kushner is more famous today for his involvement in the pattern and decoration movement, but also in the early 70s, he pushed the boundaries of a performance piece with an event called Costumes Constructed and Eaten. The entire event, it was done like a happening where he sewed and bedecked friends in various foodstuffs who would wander around a gallery, and the friends would encourage others to eat the food off of their bodies and off of their costumes. I'm sure many of you know of Lady Gaga and her meat dress, but she was certainly not the first. In '87, Canadian artist Jana Sturback fashioned a dress for herself in meat, and the Chinese artist Zhang Juan, who is known for wearing all sorts of food, also made himself a meat suit. Zhang Juan is also controversial, like the Viennese action artists, for doing some pretty nihilistic artwork, much of which involves food. And I'm not going to show those to you, but when his work is posted on social media, they immediately get flagged and pulled. But I want to encourage you that if you ever decide you want to wear food, you would certainly not be the first. Dating back to 1599, William Shakespeare wrote about the character Fluellen, who wore a leek upon his hat, and he actually beats the character Pistol with it and makes him eat it for taunting him. But I'm sure many of you know of Carmen Miranda and Freddie Mercury, who both are wearing banana hats, Julia Child and Ai Weiwei in Salad, and Salvador Dali, again, our godfather of surrealism, in a bready chapeau. I'm going to jump into the 1990s and finish up with foodstuffs in art forms used as political statements. The Sarah Lucas that is one who, she's a British artist, and she stages these interactive exhibits around Easter time, inviting 1,000 women to come and throw eggs at a wall. She's done this piece a number of times, and there's great symbolism involved with eggs. It's the symbol of fertility. And her ideas behind this is for women to take back their ownership of procreation, and it's celebratory, but endowing her participants, renewal and growth, and putting the reproductive act back into their own hands. Felix Gonzalez Torres has created 19 of these candy pieces in museums around the world. And his work was targeting themes about the HIV crisis. The installation is an allegorical portrait of the artist's partner, Ross Laycock, who died of an AIDS-related illness in '91. The candy in every single museum starts off at exactly 175 pounds. And participants, you know, when you go to a museum, you're encouraged, you can take a piece of candy. So it's an allusion to the diminishment of his partner and the wasting away before dying. So it's a sad piece once you understand and you see it. Two very important political statements now being made by and about Black artists. Carol Walker in 2014 built this 70-foot long, 30-foot high bleached sugar sphinx. And it was it depicted an African woman, but in the shape of a sphinx. And it was an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who refined the sweet taste. It was built in a Domino sugar refining plant that was about to be torn down. And on the right, Vic Muñoz commenting on children in the island of St. Kitts who had been forced to work in the sugar fields, created portraits of these children, and they were done on black paper with sugar. So he would move the sugar around and then take a picture. So I'm gonna finish up briefly with, I talked about the bracelet that, excuse me, the necklace that I'm wearing, which is pasta. And 2 years ago, I curated an exhibit in of jewelry artists who make wearable pieces of food. And there's going to be a link in the chat box. If you want to go and look at that full exhibit, you can see other artists that have made jewelry. So I'm going to try and change this back. That's the end of my slideshow. I'll go back to, how about that, while we chat?
Actually, would you mind if we just see you instead?
We can just see me instead.
Yeah.
Do I stop sharing?
Just stop sharing.
I'll stop sharing.
Good. And I have a question for you. I think there's something in the chat, but let me ask mine because I'll forget the names. And I don't mean to put you on the spot. And thank you, by the way, for Dieter Roth, because our Roth. I've always loved the cheese one, is one of my favorites, and I was hoping you were going to cover it. But what I remember is, and I'm going to get the names wrong, Maurizio Catalan, who taped a banana to a wall. And then I believe it was David DeTuna, who was another artist who took the banana off the wall and ate it.
And you know what, thank you. I should have included that because that was so timely and so many people know about it. And
right, that's what I was thinking. But here's my this is an odd question. The price tag on the banana, I believe, was $120,000.
Oh, I think it was $280,000.
$280,000. So when you have a piece of art like that that's ephemeral, or any of these artists where it decays, and I noticed that you also didn't include Damien Hurst. I'm sure Larry will pop in a question about Damien Hurst. How did they make their money? Because obviously no one was going to, although am I right that Catalan actually did sell some of those bananas?
Yes, he
4 or
did.
5 of them. So how did they make their money? How did they make their money?
Well, exactly that. They do these shock pieces, and then it's, I don't know if you know about the new NFTs.
No.
Oh, that's a whole other, you know, artists are making these ephemeral pieces of art, and NFTs are digital art, which everybody can see, but then somebody owns the rights to. So ostensibly, you buy Maurizio Cattleman's banana, you're paying for him to come and put it in your home, and you have then photographs of him in putting it in your home. Of course, it's not going to last, but it's, I'm torn on that. I really am. I mean, just to take the balls to do it, I think is pretty impressive, but that's how he makes his money as a shock artist. Similarly, I mean, you know, the Viennese action artists and performance artists, how do they make money? You know, they're doing something that is so brief and ephemeral. And I didn't talk about Marina Abramovic, and she's done a number of food themes. She makes these chocolate lips. So I think they cash in on their names.
But do the, and we're inviting everyone, if you raise your hand, if you have a, you know, a question that you want to ask or something in the chat. And I know this could feel like a subject that some of you don't feel, you know, as, you know, comfortable, but do the museums pay them for those shows? Do they have benefactors that help support them when they do something like that?
Yes, you know, so Kara Walker is more known for her silhouettes.
Right.
And so she makes pieces, you know, and I think most modern living artists have a sideline that is more permanent. And then they create pieces like Vic Muñoz. Vic Muñoz does tons of these ephemeral pieces, but then he makes the money taking the photograph and selling the photograph.
Right.
Now in the, you know, the Marinettis and you know, there's a surrealist story that I love to tell about Leonora Carrington, because she's known for her paintings, but she was I'm drawing a blank on who her boyfriend was. That was not Man Ray, but she painted her feet with English mustard to walk into a dinner party. And, you know, we only have it as anecdote. So, you know, the era before photographs and images that were documented, I think we're lucky to have the Marinetti images of his dinner parties.
We have a question from Marcy Dobro, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Marcy, thank you.
It's Dobro, but that's a good try. I was just wondering if your genres include the art that's made for cruise ships. Truly, it's fruit and vegetables and all that, but they are carved and made into some beautiful pieces.
That was covered more in my first topic, because that was more about craft, and there was that, I think Mary Ellen might be able to give a link if it's on YouTube, the whole idea of folk art, because you have vegetable carving, you have gingerbread houses, you have corncob pipes, and so the whole, you know, marzipan, fruits. So yeah, the whole first lecture is food as an art form, more along those lines, as opposed to the museum fine art, hoity-toity art establishment.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So do we have any more questions? I have another one for Carrie. Mm-hmm. And that is, Carrie, you're an incredible art historian. I couldn't believe the thoroughness that you had, because you always, and it happened last time, every time, and I don't mean I got you, but it's like every time I go, it's like you've already you've been there. So thank you. What brought you to this? Why inquire about this? What is this about this that grabs you enough to spend the time it takes to do this kind of research and put together this kind of quality presentation?
Well, thank you. So there are two things, and I wish I had an image to show you, but I will share. As a kid, and in the first, going back to the idea of crafts, my mother would get long, thin licorice vines, and this is the 70s, and my sisters were macrameing vests and handbags, and I learned to macrame, and I macrameed licorice vines. But I remember very distinctly in the 5th grade being taken to the LA County Museum of Art and seeing this weird painting. And I got really close, and it was little tiny dots. And somebody in pencil had numbered every single dot. And I was gobsmacked, and I wanted to try and find number 1. Well, that image stuck in my head, and 20 plus years later, I went back to the LA County Museum of Art with my childhood friend, who was my first fiance. We were engaged in the 2nd grade, and God bless him. And I said, okay, I'm remembering this piece that I saw in the 5th grade, and he was here, and I never remember the name of it. And it was by an artist named Georg Harold. And what those little tiny dots were caviar. And so 5th grade, what is that, 9 years old, 10 years old, I was completely entranced by the existence of this very weird painting, because the dots went in and out, and some were big and some were small, and they were bleeding a little, and they were all caviar. And so it started early for me. I just didn't realize it until I was an adult, that I had this sort of obsession with people making things in food. Like, my mother would, we just passed Easter, my mother would make a cake for Easter that was a bunny, and the fur would be coconut. And she would get a watermelon. This was on the cover of a Sunset magazine, I remember, and she'd carve a whale out of the watermelon to fill it with fruit salad. So I had a very good mother who let me play with the food. And I think for a lot of kids, that's how they get started, making frames with macaroni, at camp, and marshmallows and strawberries and faces. So I played with food as a kid, and it stuck with me when I wanted it. And I think also what I've heard from teachers, they can use food for kids because it's easier to clean up than paint. So that's also a factor.
All right. Any other questions before I ask a couple more? Sorry, Carrie, I was.
It's fine.
So I'm going to ask one, and this is going to sound really odd, but Eric Satie, do you know who the composer Eric Satie is? One of my, my favorite my favorite museum, bar none, and on floor. When you would come into a room, you might step on a space, and a dinner table would suddenly appear with food on top of it. Just done as kind of almost holographs. There's mechanicals that might be a huge pair. That's for, Tom, Herzog, that opens up and plays. Those were all artists that were inspired by Eric Satie, if I'm correct, right? He didn't actually create those arts himself. He was a composer.
Correct.
But he did have a food fetish, which is he would only eat white.
Oh, I don't think I knew that. That's pretty cool.
So I guess my question, are there some artists that these artists seem like that's their whole that's their approach, that's their shtick, and then there are other artists that just play with it. Do you put them in the same category, or are those kind of one-offs where these other people are deeply embedded in this movement, this food movement?
You know what, I think there are a few. I do put them all together, and I have this growing spreadsheet of artists that have used foods, because there are a few that are just one-offs, but I think they're important one-offs. I don't know of any other piece that Maurizio Catalman has done besides the banana. but now he will kind of always be associated with the banana, even though he's done other shock work. But then you have artists like Sarah Lucas, who has done a lot with eggs, but Alison Knowles and her salad, she has certainly done other things. And so it is the introduction of the ready-made. It's what's available and it's what it's around. And Salvador Dali, I mean, most people think of his paintings, you know, he is mostly a painter, and only did a few things with food, most of which were lobsters.
Were those real lobsters?
In creating the photographs, yes. Ultimately, in the telephone, no. I believe the very first telephone he did with a real lobster, and then to recreate it for museums, they were resin.
All right, and then I have another question, and I brought him up earlier, and I don't know if Larry is still with us and wants to ask, but we were in London for the Saatchi Gallery Collection Sensations, British Sensations, and that's the first time that we saw Damien Hurst, and we don't have any photos, but you didn't include him. Do you know enough about him that you can kind of explain at least what it was that he did? Because I'm going to encourage people to not only look at your thing, but to take some of the names that you have and go explore on their own.
Well, and again, there's which ones? Because, you know, there's the ones where
you know, the steer that he cuts in half. Larry's got
his, exactly. The shark and
the shark.
You know, I do, because there's also I'm drawing a blank again. You know, Jeopardy, old age. He also did the vials with items.
Right.
And so I don't, you know what, I look at his work and I like his work, the sliced shark. To me, it seems less culinary as much as it's just using, you know, the
animals
animals.
Okay. And Larry's Mr. Fox has his hand up. Larry, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question or comment?
Well, I was going to make a comment about Damien Hurst. We saw a show in London with Damien Hurst, and in one of the corners was a little, the installation you were talking about with Felix Gonzalez. So he had a little triangle of candy. So I picked up my candy, and I've got a little construction made out of that. But also, what was also wonderful about in food involved, though it was non-food, was Ai Weiwei's covering the floor of the gallery in London, and I know I can't think of what it's called, but
okay,
anyway.
So I'm going to show you because I have some here.
Yes.
They are sunflower seeds.
Porcelain.
And they are porcelain. So they're not, to me, that's more representational because they're not real sunflower seeds.
Right.
But I have a bowl of them that sit right as my inspiration. And occasionally I mail them off to friends with the note about why they exist. Those are my Ai Weiwei, my Ai Weiwei. Porcelain.
Nice.
So yes, I have a whole bunch of those right here. I do. I'm kind of surrounded with little weird food art stuff. And I have a handful of real pieces in my home. And you can see some of them on the link I shared, because I ended up keeping a lot of some of the pieces that were lent for the exhibit.
So somebody asked you a question, and I'm going to kind of rephrase it the same way. They were talking about food as presentation. You know, I was thinking of the huge banquet scenes, for example, that you might have in a, you know, movie where they, you know, constructed things. If you put that in a different category.
I do, because it is purposefully intended to be eaten. It, you know,
okay. All right.
But I allude to that, you know, with the idea of the whole futurist manifesto and how they laid the groundwork for our modern molecular cuisine, that the molecular chefs now spend, you know, they've got tweezers, you know, all of the chefs now have tweezers to make sure things are plated just so, and they'll spread the sauces on the plate to get the right aesthetic. But it's a very ephemeral form of art that they are creating for something to exist for maybe 6 or 7 minutes. Yes, and someone, Dale just mentioned, Mapplethorpe's photographs of foods. And I think there becomes this fine line between artists who are setting up a still life with food.
Oh, so Larry, talk so you can show that. Actually, talk. Larry.
Yeah, Larry has to talk so we can see it.
Yeah, this is the Felix Gonzalez Torres piece that was in the show with Damien Hurst.
Oh, so, good. If you can just put that up just slightly.
Yeah. Let's see. There it is.
Oh, I love, this is Marty. Speaking of ephemeral, there are coffee artists who swirl the cream or something, right? Do you put baristas in the same category?
Again, that, I said there's this fine line between, the craft and the museum. And there are museum companies that you can get your face made so that you can actually make your own. And there are artists now, and they're in my book, who paint with coffee. So that, they're creating with coffee. I'm never even sure if I should make that definition between the art establishment. I think so. I look at the growth of the art establishment, and these artists like the Dadaists and Surrealists, versus those who just might be playing with their food.
Right. So Larry and Rick might remember this, but we went to a funeral in San Francisco of an artist who had a very large following, but they made tortillas with his face on them.
And when my metalsmith master Alpine passed away, we were all given it was chocolate mints, and then actually Tom Lehrer just had his 93rd birthday. The musician who does and I went to a performance of his, and they had square candies with his face on them that they gave to everybody in the audience. So
yeah, that's exciting, because Mike Kirscher, who is a musician in Renaissance, is going to do a Tom Lehrer performance with us. We're looking for a piano player now. Truly my favorite. Someone says in the movie Yellow Submarine, some of the physical objects that are animated are food, like pastas.
There's a few movies. It's the one about raining meatballs.
Oh, right. Cloudy with the Chance
of Meatballs. There's a whole other animated film. So I look at that as representation of food. These artists that are making these beautiful photographs of food, I look at that more as photography, and just hearkening back to the classic still life.
So I'm going to ask one more question, then what we'll do is probably close and then ask you to go to the green room, because there are always people here that are just too shy to come onto camera. And this is a dual question, and that is, where is the future of molecular gastronomy? Because it certainly seemed like it was, and I've got Modernist Cuisine, the book, it was, 270, whatever it cost, never would cook out of it. Where is molecular gastronomy going in food? And then where do you see the next wave of food art going? So two different questions.
Ooh. I think the molecular gastronomy, that's such an open-ended question, in that who knows what's going to happen because of the pandemic. Are we going to get back to fully seated restaurants? And I think that it's going to be a lot more intimate. I think they're going to keep the numbers down. Mm-hmm. And I believe that those like Nathan Myhrvold, who have experimented with molecular gastronomy, it has become an art form that you can do in your home. They sell little kits. You know, you can make your own globules, and you can, in fact, on my Facebook today, there was an ad that showed up on how you can do your own little smoke. So I think if it comes out of the kitchens of the molecular chefs and into everybody's home, like sous vide, you know, sous vide was sort of established in the 70s, and now people own their own sous vide machines. So where it's going to go, I think, will be up to the scientists and experimentations. And Dale wants to say something.
Yeah, because just today I was thinking about where is it going, because in the New York Times, in the food section, there was a little thing that Wiley Dufresne just opened a pizza place, and it's just like regular pizza. I'm like, okay, we're done with molecular astronomy.
I could never afford his restaurants before. Now I can.
Because you can get pizza. Where food art will go, I think that's going to be up to the preservationists. And I think, you know, I get these newsletters from preservationists and kind of listen in on some of their conferences. But again, with the aid of science, that there are going to be ways to preserve various food art, to keep chocolate from blooming. There's Janine Antoni is an artist who has done these double busts of herself, one in soap and one in chocolate. And I look at Georg Harold's work with caviar that was done in the 70s that still exist. So as these things can be preserved more, I think more artists will start incorporating other foodstuffs into their work.
So before we do our formal thank yous, I just want to announce that we have 3 upcoming events coming and I believe the first one is this Saturday with Kathy Hart, Create Succulent Garden Rock Art. These are all free events. Food on the Westward Trail with Richard Foss, friend that you were able to share that incredible salad with. His is coming up. And I'll be doing a talk, Sacramento City of Immigrants. And again, those can all be found on Eventbrite. And there are links. So make sure, I'm doing mine now, that you save the chat so that you have all of that. Carrie, I want to thank you again so much for another. You're wonderful at this. I don't care what you talk about. Please offer more. And again, I want to thank you. We're going to ask Kathy to stop the recording and ask you to stay just a few more minutes in the green room with us. So thank you, Carrie.
Thank
and
you
thank you
so
all
much.
for
Thank everybody